This is the story of a tree, this lonely, ancient and wizened tree here to be exact. It's probably somewhere in the region of 500 years old and is known to some as the Covenanter's Oak on account of the exploits of Alexander Gordon as a Covenanter. Alexander Gordon lived over there at Earlstoun Castle and came from a long line of staunch adherents to the Covenanting cause, going back to before the Reformation. But before we get into that, let's go back a little bit further. If you look around much of modern Galloway, you may well think you are looking at an ancient, unchanged rural landscape. But the truth is the landscape has undergone dramatic change over the years. Many of the sheep-dotted bare hills were once forested, and even as recently as James Clerk Maxwell's time, many were covered with blooming purple heather. And the forests? Well, this is the Galloway Forest Park after all, but most of the trees you will see here are forestry plantations made of tightly packed Sitka spruce, a tree which is indigenous to Norway, not Scotland. Now, if you've been to Caerstrammon Wood by Gatehouse of Fleet, you have experienced a little of what the Galloway Forest used to be. If you haven't been, I suggest you go, particularly in May, as it's one of Galloway's crown jewels. Anyway, the point is that back in the day of Alexander Gordon, the hills and fields surrounding Earlstoun and this magnificent tree were very different. For one, in fact, this tree didn't used to be quite so lonely. All round Earlstoun there used to be an ancient oak woodland that was once hunted by the Earl of Bothwell, Mary Stuart's last husband, according to local tradition anyway. The same tradition holds that Mary herself hid in the oak tree while attempting to escape from Bothwell, although it must be said that this is unlikely, as Mary probably only got as close to Earlstoun Castle and its oak as the other side of the River Ken and what is now Earlstoun Loch on her flight from Scotland after the Battle of Langside. Dalry and its surrounds used to be so famous for its hunting that Robert the Bruce himself bought land in the area to hunt and retire to, according to the eminent Scottish historian Ted Cowan. He probably never got to spend any time in the area after that, but he may well have been familiar with it if his documented adventures as an outlaw king in Galloway are to be believed. Now, that was back when Gaelic was the main language of Galloway. The Gal element in the name is a big clue, since it essentially means Gael. The only surviving work that could be in Old Galwegian Gaelic is a fragment of a song called Oran Vagri. It name-checks the villages of Dalry, Caersfearn and Balmaclellan and speaks about feasting and hunting in Dalry. That would only have been possible because of the forest that then covered much of the Glenkens. The name of the parish of Kells also reminds us that the whole of the area was forested because it comes from the Old Gaelic word for forest, coila. So, where did those forests, and more specifically the oak woods of Earlstoun, go? Well, Alexander Gordon and his father William both found themselves on the wrong side of the law for their Covenanting beliefs. William was fined some 3,000 marks for his adherence to the Covenant, which is about £2,000 then, and now that's about £370,000. Not an insignificant amount of money for sure. He racked up more fines as he continued to defy the king's law, but eventually paid the ultimate price for his adherence as he was killed at the Battle of Bothwell Brig. Alexander was forced into hiding after Bothwell Brig, and as part of his escape is said to have hidden in the tree, giving it the name the Covenanter's Oak. He spent some time in exile in the Netherlands, but was eventually captured and imprisoned. The Gordon lands here at Earlstoun were seized and passed on to new owners, but after the Glorious Revolution, Alexander was freed from prison at Blackness Castle and managed to regain Earlstoun itself. But he also found himself deeply in debt. In order to pay off these debts, he decided to sell the ancient woodland that had once covered this land for acres around for felling. He recouped the modern day equivalent of £3.6 million from the forest, 30,000 marks in old money, and it enabled him to repurchase many of the farms and estates that had been sold while he was in exile and imprisoned. The persecution of the Covenanters for their religious beliefs cost lives, livelihoods, and caused a great deal of suffering and turmoil. There are monuments all around the countryside here to their struggle, and martyrs' stones in many of the graveyards too. There is no doubt that the killing times cost Galloway a great deal, but there were other hidden costs too, borne by the lairds that dared to rebel, and costs to the land and the environment as they struggled to regain what they had lost during those turbulent years. This single oak is all that is left standing of an ancient woodland. It makes you wonder, how many solitary cousins does it have out there, acting as living fossils of the great forests that once covered Galloway and Scotland? Piece by piece and acre by acre, over the slow march of the Middle Ages and the early modern era, they were felled for ships, beams and furnishings, forever changing the landscape and leaving only very few traces that they existed at all.